in mid stakes and high stakes as well. Something that you'll see a lot in live games and something that really goes against the computer solver theory in poker, because this is something that computers do really well and humans do not. And it comes down to the idea of finding bluffs and the idea of humans under bluffing in a lot of different situations. So the idea of opponents checking and giving up and going to showdown with bottom of range hands that cannot win. It happens a lot in live games, low stakes, but also online. I'm really finding, especially playing in the regulated US markets lately, that a lot of these, even the regulars, the professionals, really not finding bluffs and not giving the attention to detail that they should be in finding bluffs in all these spots and checking in scenarios where they really cannot win. And this most frequently occurs, I'd say, against type 3, 4, and 5 players. Type 1 elite players not doing this very much. Type 2 players usually loose aggressive, that they're a little better at finding bluffs in these sorts of spots. But this can manifest in a number of different ways, and I'm going to show a couple examples of how this shows in game and what it looks like. And the first example is, I'll call this variation checking down in position with no hope of winning. So this happens a lot in the blinds, especially when tighter players are involved, type 3 or 5. Example of this coming from a $1,000 online tournament, so a fairly high stakes tournament for online, but I'm playing recently in these New Jersey sites, so it's a little different ecosystem, softer players. The professionals definitely not playing at the level of the rest of the world quite yet. So a lot tighter play in these games, and a lot of regs not really willing to play near theory or battle or find all these bluffs. So that's kind of my mindset when playing against these players, is that they're going to be playing on the tighter side and missing a lot of bluffs. And this hand, a great example of what I'm talking about in underbluffing and just going to showdown. So this played 200 blinds deep early in a $1,000 MTT. I limped the small blind with ace-8 offsuit, going to limp almost my whole range here. Type 3 player, type professional reg, checks, 10-7-3 rainbow, check, check. Certainly could bet small here sometimes, could check. I think either's all right. My line not too important in this hand, just the idea that I'm going to play this hand as a bluff catcher here for the most part, and that when I do put in money, usually going to be beat when I'm getting hero called down. Also, with these tighter players, these type 3 players, I do tend to make a little bit of a deviation on the flop when I do know they're not continuing as wide as they should on the flop. Sometimes I put these ace-x type mid-strength hands in a check basket because I really want to use them more in the check range than in the bet range, where they're not really going to be floating and battling for pots post-flop. So while we can bet this hand sometimes, I think checking is fine too. Versus this player type, turn is a queen, not a good card for us, check, check. River comes a 7, and I check, he checks. And again, maybe we could put in a value bet here with ace-high, looking to get called by worse. This time we did not. The really important thing is Villain's hand here and his line. So I actually win against 5-2 offsuit. So that's pretty telling in revealing something about a player and how he approaches the game. If they're going to have 5-2 offsuit in this scenario, that means that they're willing to go to showdown and lose in these spots and not really looking to bluff on any street. So he has 4 opportunities here to bluff. He could have raised pre-flop, he could have bet flop, turn, or river, and is really willing to just give up, oh, I have a bad hand, I don't need to win this pot, I'll wait for a better spot. And that's something that's not going to show up in elite players or computers. I think when I participated in the Pluribus experiment, where I played against the 6max kind of supercomputer AI system, Nick participated in the experiment as well, played a lot of hands against this very strong AI system that was playing 100 big blind 6max cash. And one thing I noticed right away was its tendency to fight for every pot, that you would almost never see it not give itself at least one opportunity on one street to win a pot with a hand that couldn't win at showdown. Really, that mentality of battling for every pot, something that the computer did very well. And in general, when you look at solvers and solver outputs, you're going to see that, where they're really not just going to, oh, I don't have a good hand, I'm going to lose this one. That's not really part of their mentality and part of their strategy. So humans don't do this as well, and especially tighter humans that are waiting for good hands and play tighter ranges and are more careful, they're going to do this quite a bit. And we need to adapt to that, because we don't we don't want to be bluff catching in spots where opponents are never bluffing. And we have to keep in mind that when players are doing this, when they're checking back 5-2 offsuit 3 times with almost the nut low, that we need to make kind of drastic adjustments in our whole lines, not just the river, flop, turn, and river, to really win the most money against players like this. And it's interesting if you think about how this hand was played by the human as if how it were to be played by a computer. Because they're constantly mixing strategies and they're playing these, pre-flop, maybe it raises, sometimes maybe it checks. Flop, maybe it bets, sometimes it checks. Turn and river, etc., etc. It would essentially have to roll a dice the same. It would have to hit a certain frequency 4 times in a row. It would be very, very low probability that it would come out to actually check 4 streets in a row with a hand like this. But when you play against humans, they're not really playing these actual mixed strategies. I would bet this guy's not randomizing pre-flop, not randomizing on flop, turn, and river. Some players are, but type 3 players online, this player probably not. But when we're playing against more of these pure strategies, and especially weaker pure strategies like this, we really need to open our mind and be ready to deviate. And we'll talk about how we're going to do that and the first changes we're going to make in our game. So now looking at another hand from a live event now, a recent Borgata 2200 event played against Nick Palma, small blind versus big blind scenario, similar to the one we just saw online with talking about this idea of underbluffing and playing against opponents who aren't really willing to find every bluff and the adaptations we're going to make. Let's look at how this works in a live game against a player we may feel like has this leak, if you will. So playing 100 big blinds deep, small blind versus big blind, I limp in with king jack offsuit, the big blind checks. Ace 7-2 rainbow, kind of similar to the last hand we looked at where we have kind of the nut no pair hand, and we check, he checks. 5 on the turn, we check, he checks, and we essentially have a bluff catcher on the river where I know against a lot of good players and a lot of computers, you will run into these lines where it's kind of a delayed bluff where you'll wait until the river with the bottom of your range and then put in a 1 big blind bet as a bluff. And this is something that is a good play and works with high frequency, but not all players really have in their bag, and it's not something that a lot of people do. So there are a lot of human players who, in this spot like we saw with the 5-2 offsuit last hand, Palma may just go to showdown here with 9 high or 10 high. And I really have the read that he's not going to run one of these delayed bluffs on the river, so my king jack doesn't serve much of a purpose as a bluff catcher on the river. That being said, I do think he may be willing to call the river with worse if we're to turn our hand into a value bet. And while this isn't any sort of wild deviation in the idea that we could bet king jack high for value here on the river, it is a situation where I would be playing it differently versus different player types. And I do like it in a check call basket a lot on the river against players who are going to run these delayed bluffs and ones that I do think are going to find their bluffing frequencies a little higher than someone like Palma. So I do bet 1 big blind here on the river, and we get looked up by worse and win. So our king high being the best hand, but able to get value where if we checked, I'm quite certain it would go check, check, and we would probably win against a queen high or a 10 high type of hand, maybe a worse king high. But against players who really aren't going to bluff in these spots, I think we need to value bet wider on the river because our hand does not earn a lot of money by check calling on the river if it's never catching any bluffs in these spots. So that's kind of the idea of how things work blind versus blind. And also I do find one other, I guess, exploitative idea. These players that do not really fight for pots and do underbluff in these blind versus blind scenarios, that's really where they're exposed the most because they're forced to play every single hand in the big blind, and when it goes limp check, they have the whole deck. And these kinds of tighter players who really aren't willing to battle and go to war on every street and every pot, they're able to be exposed and exploited in these blind versus blind spots. And I think this is one way. Also, I think when they don't continue wide enough on the flop, you can also exploit them with a little more flop aggression than a solver would use or a computer would use. So this is an example of how things work, kind of showing an example of the online manifestation and then how this looks live as well. All right, so let's look at another manifestation of this underbluffing idea and spots where humans really are going to make mistakes in not finding bluffs that computers wouldn't make, and something we'll see a lot. This one coming particularly in live games, I would say low to mid stakes. You won't see it a ton in high stakes unless you're playing against a very weak player. something that professionals probably don't do very often. Even tighter pros, type 3 players probably understand this mechanic well enough where they don't make this mistake, as it is quite a costly and obvious mistake that even when type 4 and 5 players do make this mistake, I've seen them really kick themselves after the hand and be, oh, I should have bet here. I missed this bluff. So a pretty common thing that happens in poker is calling a flop c-bet out of position with a drawing hand. And then after the turn goes check, check, and your draw not coming in and missing, forgetting to bluff on the river. So checking out of position on the river with a hand that's not going to win at showdown because you're drawing on the flops, maybe whether it be queen high or 10 high, that is now going to be almost never good against the opener's RFI range. So that's the gist of it. We'll look at a specific example of how this manifests in game, what it looks like, and then how we're going to adapt to players who might make this mistake. So we're going to go to a hand from a $5,000 Hard Rock main event, large field event played last year, and against a type 4 opponent in the big blind, so a loose recreational player. I believe this hand happened late day 1, early day 2, 2K big blind. I opened low jack, jack 9 suited. Our big blind type 4 player defends, king jack 5 rainbow, checks, I bet third pot, big blind calls. Turn is a 5 of spades, check, check, river 2 of hearts, check. My action's not super important here. Don't think we really need to go for thin value on the river. And on the flop, we're c-betting at a high clip here. And really part of this lesson and the idea of players who will make this mistake is we are going to c-bet at an even higher rate, like an exploitative adjustment here to c-bet even more against players like this because of the hands they're going to show up at showdown with. So after check, check, I won against queen 10 offsuit. And similar to the 5-2 offsuit hand where we talked about a guy not bluffing on the river with a hand that cannot win, this is a similar theme. And how do we adjust to players knowing that they're going to call out of position and then go to the river and just check it down when they don't make their hand? Because if we're playing against players who are going to just call queen 10 offsuit on the flop, 9-10 offsuit, hands like that on king jack 5, and then give up on the river, then really we should be c-betting even more because we can c-bet hands like ace high. And if we're never going to have to face the river bet, I mean, that's kind of the level 2 adjustment of c-betting more against these types of players. And getting a little bit ahead of myself, I guess. Our first adjustment will be that we call less on the river as a hero call. So when we do face a river bet on this 2 of hearts from the player, I think it's going to be more weighted towards value hands. We're going to see more kings, more 5s, more ace jack hands like that, and less of the queen 10, 9-10. If sometimes these drawing hands are falling into a category on the river that just checks and loses. So our first adaptation will be to call the river less as a hero call. And our second major deviation will be to c-bet more against this player, knowing that we're able to get value from these drawing hands and also not face a difficult decision on the river where they're going to turn this hand into a bluff when the draw misses. So this is yet another manifestation of humans not finding bluffs and the idea that people play pretty poorly, and especially at mid stakes, low stakes, and you can really take advantage of situations like this, but not something that a computer is going to do. Like obviously a computer is probably going to find most of the bluffs that it needs to make to win. So looking at solver outputs not always going to give you the same answers as playing against humans who make real mistakes and big mistakes. So this is something that I've seen a lot in my years, especially at live poker, and something we need to keep an eye out for. All right, guys, I want to look at one more example of this underbluffing exploit we're talking about, and a spot where I think a lot of weaker players, type 3, 4, and 5 players specifically, do not find the bluffs that good players and computers find. And a certain situation where I think they're really not bluffing as much as they should be, and we have to make kind of drastic adjustments to what we're going to be doing on the turn and river because these players really aren't finding these bluffs as much as they should. I actually pulled a hand from a 10K online final table that I played a couple years ago. We actually have a full hand history review with Nick going over every hand of this final table later in the course. One of the more fun parts to make as we really broke down every hand, everyone's decision, and really instructional part of the course there on this final table review. But I really just pulled this one hand and to talk about the board texture, the dynamic, and keeping in mind that these two players in the hand, talking about Ami, Bearer, and Nicholas, they are not weak players. These are type 1 players, so they're not really guilty of this exploit. But it was the situation that really we see this manifesting, and we're going to go into this a little bit, but I want you to disregard the actual players in the hand, the fact that they are good players and they will be bluffing in these spots. And also we do get a river, which is a bit dynamic and does change things. I do want to talk about how the turn and river play in theory and how they should play, and then what I've frequently seen in game, especially in large field live events and mid-stakes events and playing against weaker players or tighter players, what actually happens. So this hand starts with Ami opening the cutoff for 2.1 big blinds, about 70 effective. Nicholas defends. We're playing four-handed at this point at the final table and getting a Jack-10-9 flop. This board being one that you see a lot of c-bets with these under pairs, kind of using them as bluffs, sometimes as multi-street bluffs. And this is something that I already off the bat, probably players are not finding if we're talking about under bluffing, type 3 and 5 players especially. We will see some of them just checking immediately and giving up on this board. But I will say that professional players do find this c-bet more often. So this is not really the focus of our discussion here being on the flop action, but more on the turn and river and how these mechanics work. So the one-liner completes the King of Hearts. And if we're talking about how an elite player would proceed or a computer, we're going to be bluffing with some frequency on the turn and some frequency on the river. And having some hands like Ace X, probably having these types of hands with some frequency, pocket threes, pocket fours, not willing to wave the white flag, because when we do bet this flop and get called by the big blind, and now we have the one-liner completing on the turn, our pocket threes are really worthless at showdown. And there's kind of two ways you could proceed in this hand, one being the correct way in, I still need to find some bluffs, I'm still going to continue playing poker in position, although the board has changed adversely for my hand, or B, I give up, where, a one-liner has completed, I'm playing against the big blind, I wave the white flag, I now lose this pot every time. And my point being in this section here is that there are a lot of players that abide by that second way of thinking, where as soon as this King of Hearts comes on the turn and they are done with the hand with pocket threes, and they're checking this turn and they're checking any river with very high frequency. So we have to be cognizant of that as we're playing as the big blind. And when we do get in spots like this and face a lot of aggression against a player who's under bluffing, we really can't hero call very wide and have to be folding quite a bit. This hand, Ami chose not to bluff the turn, so this does end up going check on the turn, and things are become a little convoluted here because he does find a river, which helps him and makes for an interesting situation here as he does river a set now on the one-liner. Nicholas checks, and Ami here, I think, has to put in a value bet with a set of threes. And like we're saying, when we're talking about good players and players that are capable of bluffing, having this ace-10 is a pretty close decision against a river bet in this spot, because if you're playing against a type 1 player, they know that they have to bluff either the turn or river with some frequency. So you're going to be facing some mixed bag of turn and river bets that you have to protect against. And a hand like ace-10 certainly falling into a hand that could call, and Nicholas does end up hero calling this hand. But a point being that playing against a weaker player, this ace-10 would be a very easy fold if we're under the suspicion that this player may be under bluffing or not finding bluffs with hands like pocket fours, pocket fives, ace X, things like that. So we really need to guard ourselves against paying off value bets against players that are under bluffing in these spots. So let's recap this under bluffing exploit and how we're going to identify it, finding the triggers, because we've talked about a lot of different examples of how this manifests, and there can certainly be more. We could spend hours on this topic talking about all the different specific situations where players do under bluff because there's so many and it's such a common theme. But focusing on the most common ones and the ones I see the most in poker tournaments is what we're going to do. And let's kind of recap real quick what we went through with the first spot being in the blinds, where we're going to see a ton of these kind of scenarios where players are not really willing to bluff with very bad hands in the blinds. The second being playing against drawing hands on the flop, which are really have to bluff on the river in most lines and choose not to and just go to showdown and check and lose. And that third spot from the online situation where an opener does get a texture they don't like after c-betting the flop, or a board change in a direction that is bad for their hand. And instead of mixing in some bluffs on turn and river, they just shut it down and go check, check. So those are kind of the three situations we went over. And if we're going to pull some ideas or general consistencies from those hands, the three triggers we're going to look for is first being that the villain is a type 3, 4, or 5 player, and mostly type 3 and 5, although it does depend with type 4 with loose recreational players. You do get some very passive loose recreational players, and I think some of those will definitely be guilty of this underbluffing, but there are still a lot of loose recreational players that will bluff more often, so especially focusing on the type 5 player, him being the most likely to fall into this exploit. The second trigger, these exploits occur most often in spots where villain gets to the river with a very wide range. So that can be spots in the blinds where it went they check, check pre-flop and they have the whole deck, or spots where they call a flop which has a lot of draws, a draw-heavy flop, or a spot where they're going to be c-betting a high frequency, and then after check, check turn, they have all these hands in their range. So usually spots where villain is wide, and that's kind of what makes it hard for these players to bluff, the fact that they have a lot of these bad hands in their range and they don't want to bluff with them, and they just go check, check. And that kind of leads us to the next trigger, the final thing we're looking for in identifying if this is happening at the table. We're playing against a villain, a type 3, 4, 5 player who has shown a tendency not to fight for every pot, or a reluctancy to bluff. So this is something we can only see through observation, and because you guys are taking this course and you're watching this video, you know the power of observation and how we're going to build those player types and collect data on our opponents. So this is something we will have an eye on throughout the day, and recognizing that this guy does not like to bluff. So we need to recognize that. And then when we reach these spots, we have our triggers. And then how do we respond to players like this when we do face aggression on the end? And our response, first off, we talked about in all these situations, is we're going to hero call much tighter on the end. That's very logical, as their range contains less bluff, so we're going to call less. Number two will be avoid building lines that include bluff catching on later streets. So that's something we saw in that hand against Palma in the blinds, where we could certainly play our hand, our king high, as a bluff catcher on the river, but against an opponent who's not going to be bluffing as much as he should, we're better off playing that hand as a value bet. And kind of builds into this strategy of shifting your lines earlier in a hand to avoid getting into bluff catching scenarios against opponents who don't bluff. So that can include more aggression earlier in the hand, and leading us to the third response of c-betting flops wider for value against these players, where thinking about that Jack 9 versus Queen 10, when we c-bet Jack 9 on King Jack X, we really like that c-bet against players who are always going to call with a draw and not bluff the river. That's amazing, and something that translates into a lot of spots where we can feel a lot more comfortable betting on flops when we know players are not going to put us in difficult spots on the turn and river with a lot of aggression when they miss their hand, and they're almost playing their hand face up in the idea that they're going to put money in honestly when their hand improves, and they're going to check and go to showdown and lose when they do not. So that's really how we're going to shift our strategy, in putting in more money earlier in the hand, not really looking to trap or play any check bluff catching lines, especially on later streets. And then when they do put in aggression in spots like this, we need to hero call much tighter, I would say, on the end, just because we know how reluctant these players are to bluff and how often they will go to showdown and lose. And we really have to take a hard look at how this player plays this situation and how often they're going to get to the river with certain types of hands. So I hope that was informative and something to look for, especially in your live games, especially in your mid-stakes, low-stakes type live games playing against weaker players. Something that can be really profitable if we're able to identify this and take advantage of it.